Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being with us today for our 30-minute Ask Me Anything session on making websites accessible to all families. This webinar is part of a larger consumer education webinar series hosted by the State Capacity Building Center. If you haven't had a chance as you get settled today, if you could enter into the chat box where you're from, your state, territory, or tribe, we really would like to know where everyone's joining us from. Today we're going to walk through some questions that participants have posted on the national webinar topic from 2 weeks ago. Due to the brevity of our webinar, everyone will be placed on mute to ensure that we can cover all of the questions. We know you may have additional questions today, so feel free to put them into the chat box. We've also included the PowerPoint slides from the webinar 2 weeks ago in the download pods for your convenience. Let's do some introductions. I'm Evelyn Keating from the State Capacity Building Center, and today we're joined by Josh DeLong, Donna Patrick, and Yael Mraz, who have presented on the May 9th webinar. They're from the user experience team, and they're here to help answer our questions. So let's get started. Violetta is going to put up a poll so that we can learn a little more about you. We're asking what state and territory you're from, but on this poll, we'd like to know what your role is and where you are sitting in relation to the consumer education websites in your states or territories. So please take a minute to let us know what your role is. Looks like we have a lot of state government professionals, some technical assistants. And we have some people typing in. From your Early Learning Coalition, a CCDF administrator. And from the CCR&R web designing. Great, thank you very much. Violetta, I appreciate you putting up the poll today. And again, if you haven't had a chance, just let us know what state you're from. Okay. Josh, I wanted to start with you and ask you some questions about translating content on the consumer education website. Some states have translated their material, and others link to other websites for important content, and they might not have translated their material. So how should states handle this when a website they link to isn't translated?
Sure, thanks, Evelyn. So in this case, if the sites have their content translated, but they haven't themselves, when they link to other sites externally, if those sites haven't themselves translated the content, the best thing really that a state could do on their website is to let the user know what will happen when they click one of those external links to an external site that may not be translated. And so you can do that through several techniques, but one of the most common is to provide a link title and descriptive text near the link that clearly indicates that the link is going to leave the website, and any other information that might be helpful to the user about what they're going to find there. So for example, if they're on a Spanish language page and there's a link to an external site that's not translated, you may want to note that in the description that's placed near that link. It's just kind of a best practice in terms of usability to not hyperlink text that says, for example, click here and things like that. They're small click targets. They're not very descriptive for the user, and so even if it's not related to language and translation, anytime you provide a hyperlink or a link to an external site, you want to give the user as much description as you possibly can about what they're going to get from that. Some sites also use a specific icon to indicate to users that the link is going to be an external link. So there may be, you've probably seen the little square box with an arrow in the corner. That's a common icon that's been used before on a lot of sites and is pretty common across the internet to indicate to people that they're going to be leaving to an external site. You have also seen what's called an interstitial web page, which is one of those in-between pages that provides a disclaimer to the user before they exit a website. So they might click the external link, and then that in-between page would load and notify them that they're leaving the state's website, and that they may be, entering a site that's kind of out of the control of the site that they started on. Those in-between pages can be a little bit annoying sometimes for users, but they are commonly used, and they are a way to at least let the user know that they're going to be going to an external site and that they might expect a different experience there than on the site that they left. Those are also, I've seen organizations that require actually those in-between pages as part of their web policy. So it's always kind of good to check with the state's policies on that. And I think just generally, it's very important to think about what external links you want to include on your site. And so you generally want to avoid having a long list of external links that might cause your users to click on them and leave your website. It's often more effective and efficient to include as much original content as possible on the site, both for search engine optimization purposes and for kind of credibility purposes to the user. Often a site that's being linked to externally, the user would find that site or that information through a search engine like Google or Bing or Yahoo before they would find it through an internal page on your site anyway. And so, again, it's important to be very selective and try to limit how many external links to third-party sites you have anyway to kind of optimize your site for traffic and engagement. But again, if you're going to send the user externally and translation is a concern, definitely just give them some indication through descriptive text or an in-between page or iconography or a combination of the three to help them really set the expectation and know that what they might be getting into when they click that link. So I'll pass back to you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Josh. That was really helpful. So we've also had some questions about what a state or territory should translate, when they should translate the content. And is there any industry standard or a tipping point that they can use to identify which languages to include in the translation?
Sure, thanks. So we've had this question come up before, and it really depends on several factors. I think first, states may have some requirements already at the thresholds for which they should translate content. So I would start by checking state requirements. So some states will require by state law that certain content be translated into specific languages, or in some cases, I think even not translated into some languages. Secondly, you can use web analytics to identify how many people are visiting the site and who may have their browser language set to a language other than English. So the preferred language in the user's browser is a metric that you can collect through your web analytics platform, whether that's Adobe or Google or whatever platform you happen to use. If you don't have any translated content, it's possible that users have learned not to visit that site at all, though, which would mean that your web analytics alone can't necessarily substitute for conducting some user research and actually asking the users of your site what languages they speak. Of course, you could also perhaps look at data, right, collected by either the federal or state governments about, such as census data to see, kind of estimate what percentages of different languages folks might be speaking as well in your state. If there aren't any specific requirements, it's really up to kind of stakeholders to determine how to identify the languages that the website content should be translated into in order to meet the agency's goals and kind of maximize your website's accessibility. So if you're looking to extend the reach of your site, you know from existing user research or even anecdotally in some cases that there's currently an underserved population, it may make sense to translate the content to if the additional estimated engagement would help the agency meet specific goals for serving that population, such as engagement through higher traffic numbers or interaction with certain online resources. And I think, finally, if you don't have the budget to translate the entire website, but you still feel like you're hitting that tipping point based on, state requirements, available third-party data, web analytics, and agency goals, then you may want to consider, that there are certain pages or resources that may be most useful to that underserved population and prioritize those pages for translation first.
Thank you, Josh. That's really helpful for a state to be able to think about prioritizing. Let's move on now for the sake of time. We are getting some background noise. If you're not on mute, if you could mute your phones, that would be great. Thank you. So, Josh, what would be your advice if some of the text on the website is very technical in nature? For example, states that have eligibility requirements around CCDF. So how could a state or territory ensure that that legal language is translated properly?
Yeah, so I think if translation's not completed directly by someone who speaks that language, then, if the translation on the site instead is done with like a translation plugin or something like that, then you may not be getting all of the culturally appropriate guidance and context that you would expect, and certain words can, of course, lose their intended meaning. So that could have, unintended negative consequences, especially when it concerns any legal language on the site, right, such as content about state laws or privacy policies. So if you're concerned about kind of that more technical kind of legalese language that are required to be on a lot of our websites, it's always a good idea to have a translator who actually speaks the language really carefully, read over that translated legal content, and also to collaborate with the legal department just to ensure that all of the intended context is preserved.
So what design features should be considered, Josh, when preparing to translate the website?
Yeah, so when it comes to preparing to translate a website and how that impacts the site design, one of the most common mistakes I think that occurs when translating that website content comes into play is in user interface elements, such as the website's navigation or when different buttons and things on the website get translated. Because sometimes what happens is that words in languages other than English can be significantly longer, have a higher character count, which causes the text to bleed off of certain design elements, like the buttons or the navigation bar, or break them entirely, which introduces new issues with accessibility and with, just even being able to understand what the intent in terms of functionality is from the user perspective. So it's really important to use flexible design patterns and really test any translated content with the site's designs before publishing the translated content. I think we see often that this can be an issue if a site's using a translation plugin, for example, and the user just clicks the translate button and it's all sort of automated. It's not really where anyone's gone through and translated manually. And so when that gets automated, it kind of overlays on the site and breaks some design elements sometimes. And so it's really important to test that and make sure that everything still works as intended if you're using a plugin or otherwise translating the website. The other thing that's maybe not as apparent as some of those user interface elements would be some behind-the-scenes design elements that support the site's accessibility. It's really important to think about this because they aren't things that you can actually see directly looking at the website. These are kind of things that happen in the code behind the scenes, but they're still especially important to accessibility standards. So for example, if a page is available in Spanish, is the alt text, right, the text that describes an image, for example, to a user who may be using an assistive technology like a screen reader, is that alt text also in Spanish, right? So if they're on the Spanish language version of a page, but they can't actually see that photo, they're expecting Spanish language content, and then the alt text that's read to them by the screen readers in English, that could present some problems with understanding that. Same thing goes for the ARIA labels, which ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application Labels on that page. So if again, those may need to be in Spanish to increase understanding for accessibility purposes as well. And if you're not familiar with those ARIA labels, those are kind of invisible labels that can be read by the assistive technology where no text labels exist. So they really help users with different vision impairments better be able to understand certain user interface elements that are grouped up on the page.
Thank you, Josh. So now we're going to turn to Donna and Yael to ask some questions on accessibility issues. I'm sure some states and territories are thinking, well, we've already implemented our consumer education website, so what's the best way for us to integrate some of these best practices with accessibility? And I think, Yael, we're going to start with you.
Sure.
Yael, are you on mute?
I don't think I'm on mute. Okay. All right. So I believe your question was if we've already implemented our consumer education website, what is the best way to integrate best practices? And the good news about that is that it's never too late to implement best practices and revise your work and do some mitigation. And so here are a couple of things that I would suggest. One is to conduct a comprehensive accessibility audit for your site and work with developers to fix any issues that the audit brought up. If an audit was not completed, you can ask your IT team to use accessibility plugins for their browsers so they could locate accessibility violations and follow the directions that these tools provide to fix them. Each browser comes with built-in accessibility tools, and there are also some plugins that you can add to your browser. Another thing is to make sure that your website can be navigated without the mouse, using only keyboard keys, and that any action that can be triggered with a mouse, like following a link or navigating through the website, can also be accomplished using only the keyboard. One thing to remember is that users who are blind rely on a combination of the screen reader and the keyboard for navigation and content consumption. And so using those two in tandem can pinpoint a whole host of non-accessible features if you happen to have them.
So Yael, in addition to using the accessibility audit or the plugins, what kind of questions should I ask my web designer or my IT department or my web design vendor about ensuring accessibility? Are there things that they can build into the website to ensure that my consumer education website is accessible to the widest number of people?
That's a fantastic question. I think you can ask your designer or designers, if they are familiar with implementing a layout that would promote accessibility. What do I mean by that? A few things are fundamental, such as using graphics and images in a way that would promote accessibility, not hinder it. Plan a clear navigation scheme that would be consistent across all the pages within the website. Designing a page to include short paragraphs of contents and not like, long paragraphs of non-ending verbiage. Using correct heading levels, using a contrast ratio tool to make sure that the graphics meet the correct color contrast ratio. And also, if your designer is familiar with allowing enough space for alternative ways to provide information. What do I mean by that? For example, for non-sighted people, users of the website who cannot watch a video, or for people with hearing impairments who cannot listen to an audio file, there has to be a summary or a transcript that would allow them to consume that information. So there needs to be a space allowed on the page for those elements. And you can also ask your front-end developer if they're aware of some must-have features like adding alt tags to all graphics, using headers and nesting them correctly, using distinct texts for their links, so as not to have a page that has 5 or 6 learn more, but learn more about what? Implementing ARIA labels such as the ones that Josh mentioned just a few minutes ago. And finally, and I can't stress enough how important this is, ask your front-end developer to feel comfortable to raise red flags if they encounter a feature that violates accessibility, because that may save so much time later in mitigation, recoding, retesting, things like that.
Thank you. So consumer education websites post a lot of information via documents. You mentioned on the May 9th webinar that remediation is important. How does this relate to documents? Remediation sounds very complicated, and we'd like to hear a little more about what it entails. Donna, did you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll take this one. Remediation does sound complicated. It's not really that complicated as long as you know what you're doing. Remediation is the process of applying accessibility features to files. It's important to make sure your electronic documents, such as Word, PowerPoint, and PDF, are accessible as well as the website. Some quick and effective accessibility features for Word and PowerPoint could be just to make sure that all images have alt text description and that the alt text is equivalent to the image. Make sure that the links that are surrounded by non-linked text are distinguished by a means other than color. For instance, make sure they're underlined and that they are in plain language instead of using URLs. Make sure that the contrast ratio between the text and the background colors is sufficient. You should use the contrast ratio checker to check this. Make sure your data tables are simple tables. Make sure they don't have any more than one row or column header per table. And make sure that the header cells are distinguished using the table style options. For PDF files, make sure that the PDF files are tagged, and that is usually done automatically when you convert Acrobat to a PDF. Make sure the tags represent the content it contains. Make sure the lists are lists, paragraphs are paragraphs, headings are headings, etc. Make sure the document title is filled out in the document properties and that the language of the document is set. And then make sure you've run the built-in Acrobat accessibility checker and that no errors other than those that need manual checks were returned. It's really important to remember that the more accessible your source file is, your Word or your PowerPoint file, the less work you'll have to do to make your PDF file accessible.
Thank you, Donna. So during the May 9th webinar, you referenced some best practices for accessible web design. Which one should I start with?
I think you would want to start with one of the level A priority web content accessibility guidelines. Remember we talked about level A, which is the widest application, level B more restrictive, and level level AA, and then level AAA as the most stringent application of the guideline. So I think if you start with a level A, it will benefit the widest audience and would be easiest to implement. I think the only other thing I can think of for this answer is keyboard accessibility, and I've already covered that in in my previous response.
Okay, thanks, Yael. I wanted to thank Josh, Donna, and Yael for providing us with the guidance on making our consumer education websites more accessible. We will be having more questions posted on our website with the responses from our 3 experts today. We wanted to call to your attention these resources that are available for you, and will provide you with some best practices on accessibility. And now Violetta is going to put up a couple more polls. And I think one more, Violetta. Thank you. As you're completing the poll, we'll go back to the PowerPoint, but I wanted to draw to your attention that in addition to the webinar PowerPoint from May 9th, we will have a full summary of the questions and answers on our website. And we also have 2 new guidance for you that we've developed and are now available in our download pod today and will be on the website. One on designing websites that are accessible for all families, and the second, best practices for consumer education translation. We're excited to be able to share those with you, and again, they're in the download pod. We also have some resources for you on plain language. Plain language is integral to both translation and accessibility best practices. So these are some of your great resources from plainlanguage.gov and the Center on Plain Language. And just to let you know that we'll be hosting another webinar on national resources on June 13th. We'll be joined by the National Center on Parent, Family, and Community Engagement, the National Center on After School and Summer Enrichment, folks from ACF on the preschool development grants, and we'll discuss some resources that will help states and PDG grantees with their website. Again, here is how to register for our June 13th webinar, and we thank you all for joining us today. And we thank Yael, Donna, and Josh for their expertise, and we hope that this has helped in all of you enhancing your websites or thinking about accessibility and translation. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.